Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Welcome to this week's Thursday edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show tonight,
there was an indication that up to a number of 4 people, are likely to have lost their lives in a manner which can be attributed directly to the strike.
The health minister holds striking workers responsible for at least 4 deaths and maintains their actions are illegal. Nehawu, though, is unperturbed, vowing to fight on, even if it means clashing with sister unions SATU and Denosa. Our panel for this evening looks at the legal and the socio-political implications of this strike. A ray of hope as universities, the Higher Education Ministry and the National Student Financial Aid Scheme try to find common ground on the issue of student accommodation. All that and more in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. Health Minister Joe Phaahla says up to 4 people may have died due to the effects resulting from the ongoing Nehawu strike. The union, though, is dismissing this, saying the strike could have been averted if the government had listened and acceded to their wage demands. Late yesterday, the employer obtained a court interdict preventing the union from obstructing the delivery of health services in the country. Today, the union said it had appealed that interdict, and that means that the strike continues until an appeal is heard.
Only a handful of Nehawu members sustained the energy of picketing outside the entrance of Charlotte Maxeke Academic Hospital today. Health Minister Dr. Joe Phaahla told of the impact the strike has had so far, even on lives.
We're still doing a reconciliation in the province and nationally in terms of the number of people, but as of this morning, preliminarily, I'm afraid to go into a lot of detail. There was an indication that up to a number of 4 people, are likely to have lost their lives in a manner which can be attributed directly to the strike. We have a legal team which we are consulting to look at what are our options in that regard.
In response to this, Nehawu says the blame should be directed to the employer.
As workers, obviously it will touch us because before we become workers, we are community members. We are part of these communities that we are saving. But that particular blame must be put back to the employer because the employer did the right things. From 2020, the very same employer that is playing role today have reneged from the resolution 1 of 2018 in 2020. In 2021, the very same employer offered what we call gratuity. We kept quiet. The same employer last year forced through our throat 3% that we never agreed it on. So if the employer could have done things differently in the right platform, in the collective bargaining, I don't think South Africa will be facing the situation that we are.
The CEO of Charlotte Maxeke Academic Hospital detailed the impact that the strike has had at the facility.
We had mothers who had to deliver. Unfortunately, as it was said, when you work in theatre, you do not need a nurse and a doctor only. You need the operators who must wash the instruments and all other things, the porters to move the patients. I must say that our clinical team who managed to come in became cleaners, they became everything to ensure that at least the emergencies that were there, the mothers who had to deliver managed to deliver through that. However, the elective cases, I'm told it was 61 of them had to be cancelled. And the 4 emergency theatres to try and deal with whoever was already inside in terms of this. So all the emergency scissors elective scissors will have to be rescheduled and put somewhere else, and those patients had to be discharged home because we can't keep them when we didn't know how long it was going to take. We ran 33 theatres, as I say, and so the emergency theatres, with the staff that we had, we could only run 2. I think at night they tried to open the 3rd one. I think it worked towards the early hours of the morning, where they managed to do some of the trauma cases that were in casualty. In terms of the outpatients, we normally see about 1,800 patients in the hospital, of which 1,200 come to about 52 clinics. We saw about 10, if not 15%. The difficulty we had was that these patients were allowed in, but the clerks who must register them and pull their files were not allowed in. And I'm going to what the minister said, is the clerk an essential service. Even if the doctor is here, if he doesn't have the file or the nurse does not have the file, there is absolutely nothing they can do.
There's still no details about the meeting between the employer and the union that was held earlier today, but Nehawu members say they will keep on striking until their demands are met. Diabosito, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Now, the Nehawu strike has not only raised the ire of the employer, the government, which today held the union responsible for at least 4 deaths. The strike has also pitted Nehawu against its sister union, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, SADTU. In a statement, SADTU says, "We cannot keep quiet nor turn a blind eye when our members are terrorized and harassed by fellow workers." SADTU has on many occasions declared disputes with the employer and embarked on strikes alone. "We have never coerced, intimidated, and or physically assaulted other workers who exercise their right not to strike. We're a union that prioritizes the unity of workers and have offered solidarity to many of our sister unions in the past. We can never offer our members as sacrificial lambs to anyone. If provoked, we have no option other than to call on our members to defend themselves." The statement, of course, continued. But let's have a discussion on some of the issues that we have discussed so far. And we have Patrick and, of course, Terry as our panel of analysts for this evening. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. An extraordinary 10 of events where you have these 2 supposedly sister unions now up against one another. Teribel?
Well, it's not just 2. Don't forget that there are 16 public sector unions in 8 groups. SADTU is one of the teacher unions, the biggest one, and NAPTOSA. Both of the teachers' union, although they were very angry about the treatment of the government in imposing a 3% wage rise, which was completely out of order, and I don't blame them for being angry, but they didn't go on strike last year because the government had timed it just in time for the matric exams, etc. So
just to pause, sorry to do this to you, Tori. I was talking now more specifically around the issues of the past few days, where SADTU has come out, released this statement saying it's not taking kindly to their members being intimidated by Nehawu members. So you have 2 sister unions, both of them belonging to the Congress of South African Trade Unions, now up against one another.
This has definitely split the union movement. Yes. It's brought the union movement into terrible disrepute, the behavior that has gone on, the fact of targeting the health sector. Look, the health workers have been very poorly treated by the employer. The government has behaved in an absolutely shoddy manner to the health workers. But that does not in any sense justify targeting A, the health sector, and B, deploying the sort of thuggish tactics that have been deployed. So all the other unions, I'm sure they may not have made statements. SADTU has made one, which is very interesting. But I'm sure that PSA, which is another one of the big unions in the public sector, would feel exactly the same way. And many of the smaller ones will feel the same way as well. So I think we must understand too that Nehawu in this instance is actually in a minority. The majority of the unions, some 54% of the membership of the public sector who are unionized, are still in the talks about wages and negotiations and negotiating about wages and conditions. That is where SATU should be. Then, of course, if it doesn't come to fruition, if they're not happy and the rest aren't happy, they might all go on strike properly. But the point is, now is not the time to run off and, well, it is never a time to do what they've been doing, but even to strike now, I think, would have been wrong.
And if my reading, Patrick, of what the minister said earlier today is correct, they are consulting with their lawyers with a view to holding Nehawu and whoever else is striking responsible for the deaths of at least 4 people.
Yeah, there is a clear message. It's a red flag message out to Nehawu that they've crossed a line and that they are assessing the cost and that Nehawu will face the consequences of this. So it's an absolutely clear message going to them about what their intentions are. I agree fully with what Terry is saying, that this conduct of theirs is unconscionable. To try and blame the government for the conduct of the strike because they haven't given them the increase that they want is absolutely unconscionable. And I think that on the other point that you made about the different attitudes that the other unions have taken, notably, let's talk about SABC, that SABC is acting responsibly, despite the fact that they are in exactly the same position insofar as the wages are concerned. They're not happy with the wages, but they behaved in an entirely different way, and I would say in a responsible way, in a moral way. They didn't want to disrupt the exams last year. They took that into account. They took into account the public interest, and they made a decision. Even though we're not happy, we're going to keep talking. And this is radically different from the attitude that Nehawu has taken. And I'm afraid the contrast between the two approaches by them is really highlighting the moral repugnancy of Nehawu's approach to this. And I'm afraid that they are going to be visited with serious consequences when this thing plays out.
Could it be, though, Terry, that perhaps Nehawu is, how do I put it, a lot angrier than perhaps other unions, precisely because when, some years ago, they were negotiating that three-year wage deal, it was among the first to say to others, let's accept the deal that was in front of them, only for the government to renege on that agreement 3 years down the line.
Well, I don't know if it's a question of angry or perhaps that they've lost a lot of ground and a lot of credibility. Because in 2018, the government was arguing for a 3-year wage deal, a multi-term deal. None of the unions wanted it. They all agreed in their caucuses they did not want a 3-year deal because of the way inflation moves. They wanted annual deals. Nehawu argued, and well, SATU, the COSATU unions tended to support them, and some of the smaller ones too. The PSA, which is perhaps the largest of them all, refused to sign to that deal. But because they were in a minority, they had to accept it and go along with it, and they didn't go out on strike because of that. Because they were in a minority, they had to go along with the rule is the majority, in this case, make the decisions. Nehawu was seen as being responsible for that, and then correctly, the government and the third tranche said, no more money. That was a breach of contract. In law, it was a clear breach of contract. They got off on a technicality, which I don't think any private business could ever have got away with, but they managed to do it. They then imposed a 3% wage deal as well, which is, again, it undermines completely the concept of collective bargaining. So all the unions, but I think even if you're very, very angry and have specific reason, there is no justification for doing what they've done. And this idea of targeting the health sector, stopping food from going in, stopping children from being treated when they're desperately ill, stopping ICUs. This is not on. Yes, they can come back as they have done now since I once raised it. 15 years ago, the unions put on the table that they needed for essential service workers a minimum service agreement. Yes, I think they need one. Government has refused to do it. Instead, they've tried to increase the definition of essential services, which again annoys the union. But no matter what your annoyance, cannot do what they've been doing now.
Should it be let scot-free on this one, Patrick? Because it's a mystery to many that the government hasn't gotten down to negotiating this service level agreement with the unions, and it is a sign to unions that it doesn't take them seriously and will never do so until they embark on some of the measures we are seeing now, which, as both of say all of us agree here, is less than desirable. But there are workers on the ground. Listening to them, across our radio stations. We've had angry workers saying, this is the only language that the government understands.
Well, where I agree with, it's a mystery to me too why they haven't got this minimum services agreement. Particularly in a hospital, you can put a minimum service agreement together, sort of at a national level, based on certain activities that happen in hospitals. For example, you can identify ICUs. You can identify the trauma unit. You can identify the critical care units, the ICU units, and so on. And say in all of the hospitals, I think there are about 400 hospitals and clinics around the country. In all of them, that those people and those areas, the most essential ones, where the greatest risk of death, is likely to exist, that all workers in relation to those areas are ring-fenced and isolated, insulated from any strike action at all. And, to me, it's an utterly reasonable proposition to put in place. And the purpose of the strike is to effect economic harm on their employer to submit to a union's demands. It is not to damage and destroy the employer, which seems to be the kind of thing that's going on in all over the country now. And a strike should be conducted in an orderly manner, a peaceful manner, but with minimum harm, and depending on the nature of the organization that the employer operates, particularly in a hospital, as I've described. And there's absolutely no reason that I can conceive why these agreements haven't already been put into place, either at a national scale and implemented on a hospital by hospital basis, customized for each hospital, like you have the safety system, where if there's a fire, everyone knows where to go. If there's a strike, everyone knows who stays, and everyone knows who's protected. And the unions respect that, the union members are protected. They can continue their strike, leave them, not harm the public, the patients. They can avoid deaths, to take reasonable measures to avoid harm. But at the same time, they can still inflict economic damage and hardship on their employer by withdrawing their labor. And so there's no reason that I can comprehend why it hasn't been done. I don't know whether the government thinks by putting such agreements in place, it's an invitation to somehow say, okay, we are anticipating you're going to strike, and we're making measures in case you do strike. We've got a system to protect these areas, and somehow it's some sort of invitation. But I think if that's so, I don't think the logic is sound.
There's a I think I was at high school when we used to do some of those quotable quotes things. And someone once said that leadership is judged as much by the things a leader does, but also by the things that they don't do. So I mean, is there no argument to be made that government should also take responsibility for not having shown leadership, for not having anticipated the situation, the ugly, it must be underscored, situation we are in now, where the old, the sick, the infirm, pregnant women, and so on have to suffer things. We're not saying this situation could have been totally avoided, but perhaps it could have been, minimized. Maybe things would not have gotten to this point if that agreement was there, or we would all be able to see Nehawu for whatever it is and whatever that means.
Well, why didn't they simply picket the government, picket union buildings, picket the president, picket something like that? Stop coffee being served or the local drinks to the ministers, etc. You can do that sort of thing as well. And I'm not being amused, sort of trying to be funny here. The point is, I've been on picket lines before in many years in different countries when I was in exile. I've stood on a picket line with ambulance drivers, and they watched things, they let in certain things, certain ambulances went out, it worked smoothly. There was no problem. And there wouldn't be a problem if there was an agreement, as Patrick was saying, in place at the various hospitals. There's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't happen. But why target the health sector? We're talking about the public service. Now, the point is, yes,
but isn't that where Nehawu organizes?
Nehawu organizes right across the board. It's the National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union. It has membership right across the board. It's one of those strange things because you've got the NSFAS as well, which is the nurses union, but there are nurses that are members of Nehawu. So you can forget about that old rule that Kosatu had of one industry, one union. It doesn't work that way at all. It's still across the board. So they could have actually picketed anywhere else. They could also have gone back to the negotiating table and united with the other unions and perhaps built what is desperately needed, I would argue at this stage from a trade union viewpoint. They need greater unity and they need greater clarity about where they want to go. The government, yes, does bear a lot of responsibility for the anger that exists because the health workers have been treated incredibly shoddily. Yet they're the ones who were to the forefront during the COVID, the pandemic. They were the ones who put their lives on the line. And the government said, oh, this is wonderful. And then they didn't pay them. And we now have an admission that we have something like 88,000 nurses too short. We've got doctors who are not being employed because for some reason there's no budget or whatever. At the same time, we have an extra 2 ministers to an already bloated cabinet that is the biggest in the world.
Well, Patrick, I mean, the finance minister has been arguing that it's precisely because they want to attend to the very same issues that workers are raising, that they are overstretched, they are overworked, they need more, they need, to live sane lives as well, so that they can have they can muster all the energy and the courage they need to do their job as diligently as they did during COVID. That government needs the money. In other words, it can't give them the kinds of numbers that they are asking for, precisely because the government wants to employ more police, more nurses, more doctors, more teachers, and so on.
Yeah.
Well, why don't the money if they have to? They always seem to be able to. So they could actually do so should they have the political will to do so. They simply have not shown it. And they have been grossly irresponsible as well. They've been irresponsible about the unions and the treatment of their own employees. And they've been irresponsible in not having proper policies in place, etc. That we all know. We can criticize them. At the same time, the union should get together perhaps and say, look, we've had enough. We, as one of the your Nehawu people said on your program a little bit earlier, they represent the communities as well. Workers live in the communities. We have a situation now where the majority, so many, 13 million people live on social grants. We get an increase of 5.6% in terms of child grants. But food prices alone, 13.5% have gone up. So people will get more and more hungry. There will be more and more thrown into abject poverty. This is the reality. We know that. This is a particular incident, but we need to look at that and say, look, not just concentrate on Nehawu, we have to deal with that at the moment, but say, look at why the anger exists. That doesn't justify what the actions that have been taken, but also do something about it and decide, come up with we're great at policies, we're just useless at implementation.
None of this, of course, is taking place in a vacuum. Patrick, an interesting thing happened in Parliament this afternoon. The President was answering questions, and he admitted to having received a report, I think he said 2019, from the Public Service and Administration Department, a report he had commissioned, which of course looked at the size of the government. Remember, one of the big promises he made right at the beginning was that he wants a lean and mean, fit for purpose a government and so on. And this afternoon he admitted to sitting on the report, and this in the same week that he, as Terry Bell was saying, announced a cabinet that was that had at least 2 ministers more, in spite of the promise he made years ago that he would, like to see a lean and mean government. And the reason I'm raising this is because even though the Minister of Finance has argued that the reason they can give public servants the money that they are asking for is because they want to employ more public servants. But as we are having this conversation, we have no idea as to how many police this country needs, how many teachers, how many nurses, and where and whether we are actually going to get them.
Yeah. Well, that's right, but that is interesting, I must say. At the same time as there's this talk of trying to streamline the public service, make it a professional service, and right-size different departments. You need more police, you need less of that, you need more of that, and so on. I mean, Terry's right. The political will has been lacking to implement it. There's a lot of talk about it, but it has not actually been implemented. And what leadership requires to do in a situation like that is not only take the line, but do the line, to say, okay, and act on it and make it happen. And, let's not forget, actually, that this happens in a macroeconomic environment, which is absolutely quite scary. South Africa has got a shrinking economy, a burgeoning unemployment, potential, unrest amongst many, many desperate people. And there's hardly any money left in the purse. We're on junk status in the eyes of the world, and all of these other macroeconomic issues have come into it. And behind all of these wage negotiations, these incidents happening, there's a kind of macroeconomic model for the country, which is the sort of elephant in the room. Do you have a kind of, consume to grow, or do you have a grow to consume kind of macroeconomic model? And those kinds of issues haven't been resolved. And so what has effectively been happening and has been a macroeconomic belt type of necessity to live within our means, to try and constrain debt. And all of this is feeding into the kinds of activities that we are seeing. And until such time as there's kind of an openness and a transparency by government in how they're going to deal with their employees, their own employees, not just as government and alliance partners and their employees, about how they're going to do this, I think that this suspicion and the mistrust will continue.
You know, I can't resist this, Terry. You will recall, I mean, in years gone by, there was a view, certainly among a whole group of ministers who were ex-unionists, but who were in government at the time. They remember the talk about a labor aristocracy. And I'm just, in my mind, I can see all these ministers, your ex-unionists, you know, in the form of like your labor minister, you know, your finance minister, your economic development, trade and industry, competition minister. And one wonders whether they are not taking the hard line because, in other words, the debates haven't gone back to that era where people just feel that the unions just want more and more and more, and they shouldn't get it.
I think basically, you know, the fact that individuals don't change the corporate structure changes the individuals. If they don't toe the line, they're out. So they very quickly toe the line. Tudas Nasi, you're right, he was General Secretary of SADTU. Ebram Patel of the textile workers. We had Wana of the mine workers, who used to be paid by Anglo-American, incidentally, when he was the president of the Mine Workers Union. So, you know, the unions have become very bureaucratized, and you have this seamless move from the shop floor into union positions, into government, into ministerial positions, and then very often afterwards into business again. And I think this is something that should be stopped. We don't need, I think ordinary people, perhaps I'm naive, but I actually believe that the majority of people in South Africa know what is wrong, see what is wrong, would agree with the basic political program that we have, probably the best in the world, in the Bill of Rights. And they should come together as citizens and say, right, we've had enough of this. We're not going to have a political party where we elect a president. All you have to do is corrupt the president and you've captured the country. No, let's have something. Let's go to get together and again have a proper democratic UDF, if you like, a citizens coalition. That might be the way forward. I don't know. But that's the way we should be thinking and talking, I think, because I have quite honestly given up hope after this time that we'll ever get a real change and any real political will out of these people who sit actually in their little bubbles, very affluent bubbles, and try to placate us with loads of promises and very, very little production.
And one could argue, Patrick, that perhaps if you know, the government had made sure, or at least made an effort to ensure that, you know, it delivers on its part of the bargain. You recall the president said last year in his State of the Nation address that we're going to have this social compact. That social compact assumed a situation where, you know, all the social partners will sit around the table, talk about how to increase employment, how to rebuild the economy, of course, and within that process, or inherent in that process is, you know, that bargaining, but which also means that, you know, your labor unions, who are talking about now today, will commit to a specific program, to specific things, but also they will agree to forego certain things in the interests of rebuilding the economy and creating more employment.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that is the ideal, of course. You know, that's why NEDLAC is there, to have these discussions and to do these, come to these arrangements, to listen to each other and to accommodate each other. But I'm afraid, I mean, I haven't heard much from NEDLAC, I don't know, during the last how many months or even a year. I don't see it as visible, acting as it should be, as the tripartite well, not alliance, but arrangement between the state, labour and its employees. It is the venue to do this, have this conversation and to strike the kind of deals that could make up such a compact. But before even that happens, you need a climate, an environment which is conducive to it, a climate of trust. You need a reasonable degree of trust, not absolute trust. You can't hope for it in an imperfect world, in an imperfect history that we've got, but a reasonable degree of working trust to enable people to talk to each other honestly and to quietly make propositions and try and solve their problems. We need a problem-solving exercise at a macro level to make this thing happen. And I'm afraid that quality engagement could be done with facilitators, expert facilitators, to manage a conversation with them on a no-fear basis and a no-commitment basis, to get the essential fears out and try and construct something to redirect the management-labor relations, because we've slipped into this ongoing spiral of confrontational labor relations, adversarial labor relations, and far away from the ideal of constructive, collaborative kind of labor, where there's mutual respect, where there's interdependence between the two parties, and they respect each other and they can trust each other. We've slid so far down the scale of trust that to try and revive, the kind of climate that it would be necessary to make the negotiation of a compact possible is very difficult. But let's never rule it out. I mean, ruling anything out is far too pessimistic. We have to hope that there must be some way out of it, because we have to solve it. It can't go on like this. And so, if the olive branch can be given out, something from the government, something from the unions, to say, let's try and turn over a new leaf. Let's look at things differently. Let's look at the way we bargain. Terry mentioned about the collective bargaining in the public service. I think it's dysfunctional. The government sets a budget for the year. That's how much we're going to pay the civil servants. It's X% to Y%. And then they go into the bargaining, and that's the range. It's a very narrow range, and there's not much room for movement. And, so the actual process of bargaining, which is a huge exercise, take meetings and getting people going and so on, I think it very much has exhausted its efficiency, and that a new way of bargaining, a new way of reaching the people, the members, the nurses, the doctors on the ground, that you're going to be dealing with their needs and they're going to be listened to, has to be looked at. And so otherwise we're going to be going down into the spiral of ever-increasing violence, ever-increasing frustration and damage to property, et cetera, which we've been trying to avoid for I don't know how long.
Well, hopefully not, for the sake of all of us. Patrick, Terry, let me thank both of you for agreeing to come on this evening. Thank you. Time to take a quick break. When we return, Wits spokesperson Sharona Patel gives us an update on the student protests at the university that have led to some suspensions and a disruption in teaching and learning. Wits University says it will continue to engage in talks with members of the Student Representative Council to try and find a solution to the current impasse. It's been over a week of protests as students demand that all those owing 150,000 rand or less be allowed to register, and that the 10,000 rand upfront fee for Wits residents be waived, and for the 45,000 rand NSFAS cap for residents to be scrapped. Joining me now is Sharona Patel, who is the spokesperson for Wits University. Evening, Sharona. Thanks very much for your time. I mean, earlier I heard the one of the members of the SRC saying they had put that a moratorium on the protests with a view to, or with the hope, I should say, of engaging with the Vice Chancellor and his team today, but did that happen?
Yes, so thank you. Yes, yesterday the SRC put forward 3 more demands. The first one was that, a police be taken off campus. The police haven't been there since last Friday, and we also didn't invite them on, but that was the first. The second demand that they said was that they wanted us to get rid of the private security. And we said we do that as long as there was a commitment that there wouldn't be a disruption of classes, or a blockage of the entrances, or destruction of property, etc. Today things were pretty peaceful and calm, and we've thus reduced the number of security officers there. The third was obviously the lifting of suspensions of some of the students. However, to answer your question, they also asked, we asked them, if we could engage in dialogue. And yesterday a meeting took place between the Vice Chancellor, representatives of management, and representatives of the SRC. So that meeting did happen yesterday. At that meeting, I think there was a lot of talk about engagement, about how to move forward, how to get through this impasse. And I think the commitment was that, we can and will meet again. The SRC was going back to the student body and then would come back to management just to decide on a way forward. But at least talks are happening and there's lots of engagement happening, which is great.
Okay. Were any timelines set?
No. So at this stage, we're just waiting for members of the current SRC to come back to us.
Okay. Did you agree, just to pick up on a couple of things you've just said, did you agree to those members who were suspended to lift the suspension?
No, so we haven't agreed on that. There are currently 7 students who have been suspended, and we've said that that's a legal process and we'll let the legal process take its course. So that's a separate issue. The SRC members whom we met with, the suspended students were not amongst that group.
Did that, I'm keen to know what their response was, whether that went down well with them, because throughout the week they had been saying that they want to represent the students as the people, as all the people, as the group that had been elected by students to represent them.
Yes, so we're still meeting with the SRC, all except one who has been suspended. And the conditions of his suspension. So firstly, he was suspended because of some very serious, allegations against him. We've got quite a lot of evidence against some of the things which were done. So it's not, he's definitely not suspended because he was protesting or anything like that. He was suspended because, and all 7 of them were suspended for different reasons, but it's because they intimidated others. It's because they incited people to disrupt classes. It's because there was damage to property. And we've got this evidence, we've got statements from people, we've managed to identify the 7. It's some were much more serious than others. And we're saying, well, part of that suspension condition is that these students don't return to campus until the disciplinary process takes place in full. And we're treating them as we would treat any other student. Why should we treat members of the SRC differently from members of the other student, the rest of the student body? We also believe that people must understand that there are consequences for our actions. I think more often than not, we have all of these things erupting, at universities, everywhere else, and we always look for amnesty or political solution out of it. And we're saying no. If somebody's broken the university rules, they must face the consequences thereof. And so we will continue to with that legal process. So that's on the one hand. We are speaking to the rest of the SRC, and we were hoping to find a solution or way forward, be that through mediation, through a third party, I know the Premier was keen to intervene, etc. But at the moment, there's dialogue. So I think that's positive. Okay.
Now, the issue of the student accommodation and the caps, especially as it applies to NSFAS students. Now, we understand there is this initiative to bring the NSFAS universities, not just Wits, but also the Ministry and Department of Education, to try and see if no solution can be found. That's a conversation I'm having next. But what is Wits' attitude towards this initiative?
So the university heard about this 45,000 rand cap on accommodation. And we knew that that doesn't work for Wits students, especially those in Wits' residences. Now, residences are not just, firstly, we're in the economic heartland, of the country, and so things are a lot more expensive. Secondly, it's not just about the accommodation or the roof over somebody's head. It's about the wraparound services that we offer. It's about the sports. It's about access to the grounds. It's about the tutoring we're doing in residences to ensure that students come out and they learn holistically. They're holistically developed students. So 45,000 rand is way below the minimum that we would charge, for Wits residents. So we objected to this. We wrote to NSFAS. We objected to it. We put through our motivations for why we couldn't abide by the 45,000, but these were overruled. So we're keen to open up that conversation again through University South Africa, directly with NSFAS, etc., because we believe that that amount just won't work for us as a university. As an interim measure, what we have done is worked with our private accommodation service providers, and they've agreed to the 45,000 rand cap for this year. So students who are in NSFAS who require accommodation can then go to the private service providers who will accommodate them for this year within that 45,000 rand.
Okay, we'll see how this one pans out. But Sharona, thank you very much for your time and for updating us on what is happening at Wits as things stand. She is the spokesperson for Wits University. Now, the 45,000 rand student allowance that I've just spoken about with Sharona for accommodation at universities and colleges has been one of the reasons cited by protesting higher education institutions students. From NSFAS, we are now joined by its spokesperson, Silumezi Skosana. Mr. Skosana, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. How hopeful are you that this initiative will yield some results, especially on the back of what you heard Shirana Patel saying just now are the challenges that Wits University, for example, faces, which to me was an indication that they are not going to barge on this one?
Thank you very much, Vuyo, and greetings to you and all the viewers. I think there is room for optimism, and I'm fairly happy I am happy, let me put it that way, to hear what Shirona is saying, because I see a genuine commitment by all stakeholders, to try and find solutions to the problem. So the process that Wits University has embarked on with other stakeholders such as NSFAS, as well as the Department of Higher Education, in trying to find solutions to the problem, I think are plausible. On the one hand, NSFAS has had meetings with SAUS, the Student Representative Union of South Africa, where we discussed issues such as progression models, appeals, allowances, as well as the 45,000 cap. And we came to an agreement that there is a way of finding a solution to this. For example, we agreed with SAUS that they will go to the ground, collect and collate details about the students that are NSFAS funded and have been negatively affected, by the cap. And then upon receipt of that information, we will engage the over 450 student accommodation service providers that came through our student accommodation portal, to participate in the workshops, where we have walked them through the accreditation process that we sought the private sector to assist us with. So we believe that once we've got this information exactly as to what's happening on the ground, as promised by SAUS, we'll be able to step in with a practical and pragmatic solution in the provision of accommodation that would fall within the 45,000 rand cap.
But does SABC have the expertise, the resources to undertake that kind of work?
Well, if the kind of work is the collection and the collation of such information, yes, they have such expertise, I would say, because even in our initial meeting, they were able to share with us what information they have on the ground in terms of the numbers of people that require beds. And I think, as maybe Shirona may confirm, sometimes it's not a question of whether the beds are there but unaffordable, but it's also a question of the beds just not being there, whether they are in whether they are above or below the cap that has been put by NSFAS.
Well, it reminds me, or what just said reminds me of what the student political formation said last week when they were they came on the program. They were saying part of the problem is that NSFAS is too centralized, and they have been calling for the decentralization of the fund, so that you are able to do what you have just asked SABC to do now.
No, true. We are working on that one, on the basis that we have seen that some information has fallen through the cracks in between, us, communicating with the institutions. So we're working on a solution of ensuring that the student aid scheme, the student aid scheme personnel at universities are equipped with the necessary knowledge of knowing how the NSFAS system works, because we have been approached by some SRCs saying, deal with our problems directly, or rather deploy somebody on campus that can answer all the questions that we have, somebody that would have access to our databases and technology and be in a position to answer questions on the spot. We have taken note of that contribution, because in other cases, we work directly with the students, like in the case of TVET students when it comes to the disbursement of allowances. But in the case of universities, you will find that we will rely on the admin capacity of the university to disperse such allowances once we have made upfront payments to them. So yes, we do take note of the fact that we may need to set up regional teams that will attend to problems like this.
Okay. Slumezis Kwasana, let me thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you very much, Vuyo. And thank you, Shirona.
He is the spokesperson for NSFAS. That brings us to the end of tonight's program. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good night till we meet again tomorrow.